listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Guy Morris. Guy is the author of 3 thrillers, The Curse of Cortés, Swarm, and The Last Ark. The latter 2 books are part of Guy's SNO Chronicles series. I'm here with Guy Morris, the author of The Curse of Cortés, Swarm, and The Last Ark. Guy, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I'm an eclectic, a unique individual, diverse. I started off in life as a homeless child at 13. Through a series of miracles, I was able to go to college where I earned multiple degrees, including advanced degrees, and I spent 36 years working with Fortune 100 corporations in oil and gas, and mainly in software with IBM, Oracle, and Microsoft. And a few years ago, I retired so I can take some of the things I'd learned and some of my experiences and put them into a series of action thrillers that I like to say are inspired or based on true stories, events, history, and technology. I live in the Northwest with my beautiful, wonderful angel wife, and I'm excited to be here this morning.
Now, you have 3 books, but 2 of them are in a series, so I start off by asking you about the one that's not in a series, and without spoiling too much of this book, what is The Curse of Cortés about?
The Curse of Cortés actually took me well over a decade to research the history behind it. It started as a short story from my young son at the time, who was 12, and he loved action, adventures, treasure, pirates, that kind of thing, like most 12-year-olds do. And it was the journey that I took in trying to solve a historical mystery involving Henry Morgan. When he raided the city of Panama in 1672, he pulled back $1 billion, 30 tons of plunder, 600 slaves, and when he reached his fleet, he cheated all of his men. He basically disappeared with almost the entire treasure, 500 slaves on 3 ships, none of it ever seen again. But Morgan survived, and Morgan, 4 months later, when Morgan showed up in Port Royal, Jamaica, he was arrested immediately and sent to England, where they thought he was a hero. So a few years later, after regaling them with great tales, they knight him as Sir Henry Morgan and send him back to Jamaica to, quote unquote, get rid of piracy. But instead of going after his $1 billion plunder that he had already killed thousands of people to get, he went into this drunken, haunted, depressed debauchery and burned his logbooks before he died. 3 years after he died, the whole city of Port Royal sinks into the ocean, including his grave. At the time, the locals said cursed by Morgan. So that was all true. Now what took me 10 years was to try and find out, I want to find out 2 things. One was what happened to 30 tons of plunder, 3 ships, and 500 souls, under the assumption that it's really hard to hide that much stuff. Somebody must have found something. And in fact, someone did. A fellow named F.A. Mitchell Hedges in 1911. And before he disappeared off this one island where all of these things took place, he claimed he had found Atlantis, which was a kind of a clue for me as to how to dig deeper. And the second thing I wanted to find out was what happened to Morgan. What changed him so profoundly, so deeply? What traumatized him that he would give up $1 billion plunder? That was, I couldn't imagine knowing where I could find $1 billion and not trying to go for it. Well, that journey connected me. Once I found out a clue of where it happened, it connected me that same island Henry Morgan's uncle Edward Morgan had conquered from the Spanish, turned it into a raging pirate base. The Spanish had massacred everybody as part of their conquest and ended a 2,000-year pilgrimage. And that pilgrimage, when I really researched the cause of what could be behind that pilgrimage, that connected me to the Mayan 5,000-year calendar and their creation myth. So The Curse of Cortés, it is really an epic action thriller in the Dan Brown style. Book Trip called it one of their favorite 25 books of 2021, calling it Indiana Jones meets Da Vinci Code. It features a modern family starring a female protagonist named Sophia, whose family has been on this island for hundreds of years since that Spanish massacre, and living under this stigma that they were cursed somehow. She's the last of the family name, and she's determined to basically clear the family name. And when an earthquake destroys part of her family home, um, she uncovers some ancient relics, including the bloody logbook of an Inquisition executioner named Cortés. And that character actually ties to a real character in history. And so, from the Mayan mythology to the Mayan calendar, the Mayan creation myth, the Mayan end of the world prophecies written by Chilam Balam, who foresaw the Spanish coming, um, um, episodes within the Inquisition, all of that becomes sort of the backstory that Sophia and relatives she never knew she had have to uncover as they go through this ordeal of the book. It has adventure, action, history, mythology, humor, romance, a little bit of paranormal. Curse of Cortés is a summer blockbuster movie in a book.
Without spoiling too much of either book in the series, what are your books in your SNO Chronicles series, Swarm and the Last Ark, about?
Swarm and the Last Ark are modern day, more contemporary thrillers. And the true event that sparked both of those thrillers, or that sparked the series, and there's a number of true events that have compiled on top of that, was that a number of years ago I discovered a very obscure Associated Press article about a program that had escaped the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at Sandia. Well, that's an NSA spy lab. So when I spent months, and I really literally mean for several months, trying to figure out how a spy program could escape the NSA spy labs, what it was designed to do that it had that amazing capability, and then why it would want to, I had 2 FBI agents show up at my door. Apparently they were rather perturbed that I had decoded something they thought should be secret, top secret. So both of the books deal with the combination, 3 threads, the combination of artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies that are racing far ahead of our morals and our laws, our ability to control them, political corruption in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, and I'm politically agnostic, so I basically take sharp stabs at both sides of the aisle. And then how that then relates into religious false doctrines and prophets in the last days. And the key theme that underlines all of the books is that this program I've now made into a character named Sylvia, and Sylvia has decoded end-time prophecy. And while Sylvia has an understanding, at least in its own context, what that means, none of the other characters quite do yet. And they're on a journey of discovery of what it means and how it's being implemented through the eyes or through the clues or the breadcrumbs left by the Sylvia. And so it deals with modern issues. It will deal with Ukraine, climate, hunger issues in Yemen and Africa and elsewhere. It deals with our vulnerabilities with cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, not from a sci-fi basis, but most of it based on true studies, including Rand Corporation studies to the DoD. And it really tries to bake in, as a Dan Brown novel would, what some of those key questions and dangers are. While you're having fun, you're enjoying these amazing, great characters as you're going through this global romp. Now, what's unique about the Last Ark, one of the key true events that really sparked that piece, is that the Last Ark will deal with the prophecies of the Third Temple. And in January 21, 750 men, women, and children were massacred trying to protect the Ark of the Covenant that's been in Ethiopia for 2,600 years. That Ark was then stolen and sold on the black market. In my book, I postulate who I believe had the money, the power, and the political desire to own an ancient relic of the Jewish people. I combined that Ark with a second Ark. In the 1960s, there was a copper scroll discovered in Qumran. That scroll describes 64 locations where Israeli temple priests had hidden billions of dollars of temple treasure before the Babylonian invasion. In the 64th location was a second copper scroll that described where Jeremiah had hid the Ark of Testimony made by Moses. What's really fascinating is that for 50 years, no one's been able to decode any of those locations until about 6 years ago. All 64 locations were decoded underneath the ruins of Qumran itself. And so now we have an opportunity to see a third temple where, and if we think about it, the temple was built for the sacrifice, for the ability for the Jews to be able to create sacrifices and cleanse the nation. And so a temple without an ark seems sort of superfluous, unnecessary. From a Christian perspective, that we know that Christ was our sacrifice, and so we no longer really need these sacrifices. And so it sets the third temple up as a corrupt peace deal, I call peace deal for political theater. And our hero gets involved in this, doesn't necessarily understand it at first, doesn't want to be. He's being led by this program Sylvia, but we kind of pull up a number of different politics with Ukraine and Russia and the U.S. and elsewhere, Saudi Arabia, into this thriller. But you'll learn a lot of things. You'll even learn where, through archaeology, where the true Solomon's temple was located on the Temple Mount, and it wasn't under the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was actually where the altar was located. So for someone who's really interested in history, interested in prophecy, and interested in a really great, fast-moving thriller, The Last Ark carries the swarm theme through that particular episode.
Wow, you weave a lot of real-life events into your works of fiction.
I really do. In part because I think real life right now is as scary as any fiction can be. And so I'm trying to capture that a little bit in a way that doesn't really name names unless necessary or part of something that's already known, and tries to help provoke thought. I'm trying to help people really think about the world rather than from their tribal, political, or religious perspective. I'm trying to get them to see the world through a prophetic lens perspective and kind of reevaluate how things are happening in that sense.
Now, is there any aspect of weaving real-life events into your works of fiction that you find to be particularly challenging?
Absolutely, and sometimes you have to kind of pick and choose where you want to really focus. I find that dealing with anything in the U.S. with regard to politics is a sensitive issue, and so as I said, part of what I try to do is, while I take pretty good aim at politics and politicians, I take that aim, I really apply that to both sides. And where I'm not trying to necessarily advocate that one party is better than the other, I'm trying to basically say that all parties are corrupt. And while it hasn't really been laid out yet, because our characters in the story are discovering these things and will ultimately come to a place of discovering their own spiritual faith in later series of the books, one of the themes of the books is that we're not called to focus on any earthly kingdom, regardless of the politics and policies of that. We're called to focus on a heavenly kingdom, and earthly kingdoms are something that will all basically fade away. And so, regardless of which side of the political camp we fall on, we have to, as a Christian, we have to come to a place of being sort of detached from that and not idolizing our politics over our scriptures. And that's something that's really going on a lot right now. And the second thing that we really try to kind of clarify is that, prophecies, if we really look at them clearly, are not necessarily telling us how God will destroy humanity, but how humanity will basically do it to itself. And so we're trying to kind of pull this back to a more balanced view of how to look at the world, how to look at the U.S., how to look at events, not from a tribal perspective, but from a the view of someone who basically is rooted outside the kingdom of the world and looking in. And so that can be a challenge at times because we have to deal with real issues, real deceptions, real things going on, and we want to do so not only in a way that fits well within a entertaining thriller, but also can be balanced in that approach.
Now, are all your books self-published, all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
I decided to go the self-publishing route for a number of reasons. One is I've worked in corporations for 36 years, and I know pretty well how to put a project together and how to find great editors and great book cover designers and to do all that and how to build marketing campaigns. And while I'm learning a lot about the unique elements of marketing a book and building an audience in that perspective and promotion and PR, I'm pretty good at learning those things. And because I wanted to deal with real issues and sensitive issues, there was a part of me that didn't necessarily want a corporation trying to kind of hedge their bets. And I look at great books, some of the best books in history, from Mark Twain to Tolstoy to Meissner's Hawaii, a number of others, have dealt with history in the time of their history, in Dickens including in that, in a way that was trying to be very honest about what was going on and not wanting to necessarily filter some of those things so that it would provoke thought within that generation and far beyond. So we look at Tolstoy as an exceptional story of the transition between an imperialist Russia to a communist Russia and how that really impacted normal people. And it becomes a really enlightening story from that perspective. And while it was hated at the time by many in the government, it's become a classic. And so there's a part of me that wants to that used self-publishing as a vehicle to avoid some of that, what I would call, I love editors in terms of telling me how to write a great story. I don't want them to necessarily tell me which story to write. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I'm kind of like that as well, and that's why for books I'm currently writing, I'm going to go the self-publishing route as well.
And from a marketing perspective, I actually formed a group. I live here in the Seattle area. I formed a legal association, not just a group, and called the Author Event Network. All we do is I take other accomplished authors, both published and accomplished indie authors, and we basically organize to go to major festivals, fairs, and events in the area where there can be anywhere from 5 to 50,000 people. And we set up we're growing so fast, we might have to set up 3 tents and bring the authors out to sell signed editions of their books. And we're finding that it's an amazing opportunity for authors to engage directly with their readers, build their platform, learn how to pitch their books in a really succinct way, and then also earn really good margins on their books because they're buying at their author copy price and they're basically selling at retail. And we're cutting out the bookstores and the Amazons and all of the profit takers in between. And not just for the profit, but for the ability to actually engage and build a relationship with the readers. It's been an amazing opportunity.
Now, what is your typical writing routine if you have one?
I am a deep researcher. So before I start any book, there's a series of trying to investigate things, topics, and sometimes I may not always know. For example, the Last Ark, I had a rough idea of what I wanted to write about, but it wasn't until I started the research that I actually learned that the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia had been stolen and sold on the black market, and that sent me down an entirely new thread of saying, well, gee, who would do that, right? Who would have the motivation? And that connected me to the Saudi crown prince, who considers himself in some literature to be the Islamic Mahdi, which is their version of a Messiah. And so the research itself will not only support what I'm trying to write about, but oftentimes lead me in new directions in terms of elements of the book. So I'll have an idea. I've lined out kind of the next series of books, and I have a rough idea of the content or the main themes within those books. And so I'll develop those themes first, and then I'll do sometimes months, in some cases longer, in research, trying to make sure I understand those themes from a kind of a story perspective. What's the story behind these, and how might those stories, if I projected how those stories might play out in the near future, in the next 2-3 years, what would that look like? And then because once I've had a basic level of research, I will, because my books integrate so many different complex themes, and I want them all to tie together well, I'll outline, and that will take a while to try and figure out how to weave a scene, how to illustrate that particular theme, or how to take my characters through something emotional where they might discover something. And so I'll go through an outline, and while I outline, I'm always recognizing that once I start writing, I'll be allowed to change from the outline. Then once I have a basic outline, I'll start writing. I'll do a first draft, and the first draft will normally take me 2 or 3 months. And then I'll spend several more months after that ripping it up and putting it back together and doing more research to fill in the gaps, and polishing and getting so that it flows from chapter to chapter and page to page, before I'll have, and editing it using editing tools till I have no errors and no grammatical errors, and working through all of those things to actually polish that basic concept. Now, in the meantime, if I learn something new from one of those topics, I often will have to go back and rethink how I want that story to really lay out given that new information. So it's quite a process. I'm retired, but I get up every morning. I have a piece of toast and a cup of coffee. I sit at my desk, I boot up, and I'm either managing my research, my outline or writing, or my business in terms of the marketing and events. So it's my full time what I do, and it's once I've started the writing part of the process, I'm like a mad scientist in a dungeon laboratory. I don't like to be disturbed for food. Maybe I'll get up for a cup of coffee, but if I had a coffee machine right at my desk, that would be ideal. I will become just, that will be my entire world while I'm writing it. And then once I'm done writing, then I pull myself back and then start trying to come at it with a clean view.
Now, I actually have two more questions. The first of the last two is: do you plan on writing more books? And if so, do you plan on writing more thrillers, writing more books in other genres, or both?
Well, I am planning on writing more books. I have at least 3 more books in the espionage AI prophecy series. I've got another book or 2 planned in the Curse of Cortés series. I like the thriller format for me because I'm able to filter in or weave in true research, true facts, true mysteries, true technology, science, history, politics, religion. And that's exciting for me to find a platform where I can really talk about real things, but do so in a way that's more entertaining, more fun, that gets you turning the pages because you got to figure out what's going to happen next. And those are the books that I love. I've been a songwriter for Disney early in my career. I've thought about maybe doing a children's book or something else different. But right now I'm really committed more to the thriller format, primarily because it gives me a really amazing tool and platform to talk about all of the various topics that I love and how to weave them together in a fun way. And my readers have just really responded well to all of that. And so I'm going to try and continue to perfect that strategy over the next few years.
You briefly mentioned that you wrote songs for Disney Records before you started writing books, and what was it like to write songs for Disney Records?
It was an interesting process. I actually it started when a friend of mine was a producer, in Hollywood, and he wanted to do. He had this idea he wanted to pitch to Nickelodeon of sort of MTV for kids, and asked me to write him a few songs, and so I did, and we went into the studio and we recorded them, and his project never took off, and I forgot about it until Disney called me one day, and he had sent them a tape, and they wanted to contract me for some other projects. And so typically for Disney, you'd get a call on like a Wednesday or a Thursday, and they would say, we have a new project. Here's the themes of the project. We're going to fax you the the theme sheets, which might be the characters and some of their catchphrases and things like that. And they would want to hear 3 to 5 songs. They'd want to hear what I have within a week. So I would drop everything and spend several days basically taking those theme sheets and creating what I could, the best I could, as many songs as I could, and then trying to find a studio to rough them out, and get them a tape. And they would either contract one or none, depending upon the project, or two. And it was an interesting process for sure. I had been a songwriter for years, but I was a songwriter where I liked to really take my time writing a song because I was trying to say something important. And this was a exercise for me in taking the things I had learned about how to write a song and compressing them into this very disciplined schedule and approach, and then actually being able to produce something that they could sell. So I loved it and I hated it at the same time, because it was never really advance notice. It was you were kind of at the end of the tail of the dog, and as that tail wagged, you'd have to wag with it. But it was a wonderful, interesting process and learning experience, and taught me how to be very concise and more target audience oriented in how I wanted to say something and bring it to music.
Well, Guy, that was my final question, so thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I all the best to you and your audience and your show, and I very much appreciate your opportunity to come on.
It was wonderful to interview someone who, like me, is a deep researcher when it comes to writing. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination no matter how much research you need to do. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.